You think you've seen it all, but this story is going to blow your mind. When a black veteran walked into a restaurant, he just wanted a good meal, but a few police officers treated him with clear disrespect. Officer Michael Reynolds adjusted his collar against the biting wind. His partner, Sarah Martinez, stood beside their patrol car, her breath forming delicate clouds in the frigid air. They had been conducting routine traffic stops in the eastern district of Brighton Falls, a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, or at least thought they did. The darkness hung heavy around them, broken only by the rhythmic flash of their cruiser's lights as they illuminated a stretch of road that bordered what locals called the forgotten side of town. It wasn't an official name, but rather a whispered designation for the neighborhoods that seemed perpetually overlooked by city planning and progress. The kind of place where dreams want to hibernate, or so the more privileged residents of Brighton Falls would say. When the dark blue sedan approached, moving slightly under the speed limit, something about it caught Officer Reynolds' attention. Perhaps it was the way the driver sat, too rigid, too careful, or maybe it was simply the late hour and the location. Whatever the reason, Reynolds raised his hand, signaling the car to pull over. The sedan's driver, an African-American man in his early 60s, guided his vehicle to the curb with practiced precision. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if he'd rehearsed this scenario countless times in his mind. The officers couldn't know it then, but James Washington had indeed played this scene out in his thoughts repeatedly, drawing from decades of experience navigating a world that too often judged him before knowing him. As Reynolds approached the driver's side window, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the car. The light revealed a face weathered by time and experience, with eyes that held a depth of wisdom that might have been noticeable had Reynolds taken the time to really look. Instead, his gaze skimmed over the driver, already forming assumptions based on learned biases he wouldn't have admitted to harboring. "License and registration," Reynolds demanded, his tone carrying an edge of authority that seemed unnecessarily sharp for a routine traffic stop. James reached for his documents with slow, measured movements, his hands visible at all times. Another practiced routine, another survival skill learned through years of similar encounters. Officer Martinez hung back, observing from a tactical position, her hand resting casually near her weapon. It was standard procedure, but something about the situation made her uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way the driver maintained his composure, displaying a dignity that seemed to rebuke their suspicion without saying a word. "What brings you to this neighborhood at this hour, sir?" Reynolds questioned, his flashlight beam still trained on James's face, the light harsh and invasive. The "sir" was added as an afterthought, a hollow courtesy that did little to mask the underlying suspicion in his voice. James answered with a calm that came from somewhere deep within, a well of patience drawn from experiences far more harrowing than this midnight encounter. "I'm heading home, officer. I live just 3 blocks from here." His voice carried no trace of the frustration he felt, no hint of the weariness that came from explaining his presence in his own neighborhood. Reynolds steadied the license, noting the address matched the story, but something still nagged at him. The car was too well maintained for this area, the driver too composed. In his experience, things that didn't fit the expected pattern usually meant trouble. "Step out of the vehicle, please." James complied without protest, though his joints protested the movement. Old wounds from another life, making themselves known in the cold. As he stood, his military bearing was evident in his posture, but Reynolds and Martinez missed this detail, their attention focused on checking for more immediate threats. "Mind if we take a look in your trunk, Mr. Washington?" Reynolds asked, though it wasn't really a question. James hesitated for just a moment, not out of fear or guilt, but from a lifetime of learning to choose his battles carefully. He reached for his keys with the same measured movements, aware of how every gesture would be interpreted. The trunk latch released with a soft click that seemed to echo in the tense silence. As Reynolds moved to lift the lid, his flashlight caught something metallic in the back seat, a small pin or badge that looked military in nature. For a brief moment, curiosity flickered across his face, but he pushed it aside, focused on the task at hand. Martinez noticed it too, but like her partner, she filed it away as irrelevant to their current investigation. The trunk opened slowly, revealing its contents in gradual increments, Like a story unfolding one page at a time, what they found inside would change not just the course of the night, but the way they viewed their entire approach to law enforcement. The beam of Reynolds' flashlight fell upon a carefully arranged display case, its glass surface reflecting the light back like a mirror. Within, arranged with military precision, lay rows of medals and commendations, each one telling a story of sacrifice and courage. The officers' expressions shifted from suspicion to confusion, then to something approaching shame as they began to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. "These are," Martinez began, her voice trailing off as she recognized one of the highest military honors the nation could bestow. Her hand moved away from her weapon, dropping to her side as she stepped closer to get a better look. James stood quietly, allowing the moment to speak for itself. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful statements were made in silence. The medals gleamed in the flashlight's beam, each one a chapter in a story of service, sacrifice, and dedication to a country that hadn't always shown the same dedication to him. Reynolds picked up one of the medals with trembling fingers, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "This is a Distinguished Service Cross," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we didn't." "It's all right, officer," James replied, his voice carrying the same steady calm it had maintained throughout the encounter. "You were doing your job, but perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere warmer. I have some coffee at home, and these medals each have a story that might interest you." The invitation hung in the air like frost, an opportunity for transformation wrapped in simple courtesy. Reynolds and Martinez exchanged glances, their earlier suspicions replaced by a growing sense of respect and curiosity. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. No longer a confrontation between officers and suspect, but an encounter between human beings on the verge of understanding. James's home was modest but immaculate, reflecting the discipline that had shaped his life. As they settled into his small living room, the walls told their own story. Photographs of military service mixed with community awards and pictures of young people whose lives he'd touched through his work with local youth programs. "I served for 27 years, James began, as he poured coffee into worn but clean mugs. "But some of the most important battles I fought have been right here in this neighborhood." He handed them each a cup, the steam rising like the ghosts of unspoken conversations between law enforcement and the communities they served. Reynolds cradled his mug, the warmth seeping into hands that had grown cold for more than just the winter night. "Tell us about this one," he said, gesturing to a particular medal that had caught his attention in the trunk. "If you don't mind, sir." James settled into his favorite chair, a piece of furniture that had witnessed countless stories shared with troubled youth and fellow veterans. "That one," he said, his eyes growing distant with memory. "That one I earned on a night not unlike this, cold, dark, and full of assumptions about who was friend and who was foe." As James began his story, the officers found themselves drawn into a narrative that would challenge everything they thought they knew about courage, judgment, and the true meaning of service. The night that had begun with suspicion was about to become a lesson in humanity that none of them would ever forget. The story James shared wasn't just about battlefield heroics, though there were plenty of those. It was about the daily courage required to face prejudice with dignity, to serve a country that sometimes seemed to look right through you, and to return home to continue serving in a different way. As he spoke, the living room became more than just a room in a house in the forgotten part of town. It became a classroom where hard truths could be spoken and heard. Martinez noticed a photo on the wall, showing a much younger James surrounded by his unit. "Your team, sir?" she asked during a pause in his narrative. "Family," James corrected gently. "In combat, that's what you become, and that's what I'm trying to build here in this neighborhood. A family that looks out for each other, that sees beyond the surface to who people really are." Reynolds shifted in his seat, the weight of his earlier assumptions hanging heavy in his chest. "The youth program you mentioned, is that why you choose to stay in this area? You could live anywhere with your pension and credentials." James smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes and seemed to illuminate the room more than the layup in the corner. "Officer Reynolds, sometimes the most important battles are fought right where you're needed most. This neighborhood, these people, they're my new unit. And you don't abandon your unit. The conversation continued deep into the night, the coffee growing cold in their cups as stories flowed. Stories of courage under fire, of brothers lost and found, of communities struggling to heal old wounds and build new bridges. With each tale, the barriers between them crumbled a little more, replaced by something that felt like understanding. As the night wore on, James shared more than just war stories. He talked about his current mission, working with local youth, creating opportunities where others saw only obstacles, building trust where suspicion had taken root. He spoke of small victories and ongoing challenges, of the importance of seeing people as they could be rather than assuming the worst. Reynolds and Martinez listened, their perspective shifting with each word. They began to see the neighborhood through new eyes, not as a problem to be policed, but as a community of people working to build something better. They saw James not as a suspicious figure in the night, but as a guardian of hope in a place that needed it desperately. When they finally stood to leave, the night had transformed into early morning, the first hints of dawn painting the sky in shades of promise. "Mr. Washington," Reynolds said, standing straighter than he had all night, "thank you for everything." James walked them to the door, his movement still carrying that military precision despite the late hour. "Thank you for listening," he replied. "Sometimes that's all it takes to begin changing things." As they stepped onto the porch, Martinez turned back. "Sir, would you be willing to speak at our next department training session? I think there are stories here that need to be heard." James nodded, understanding the weight of the request and the opportunity it presented. "Of course, Officer Martinez. Change happens one conversation at a time." They walked back to their patrol car under a sky that seemed somehow clearer than before. The same streets they had patrolled earlier now felt different, not because the streets had changed, but because they had. The night's lesson in judgment and courage would stay with them long after their shift ended. Back in his home, James stood at the window, watching the patrol car pull away. He thought about the medals in his truck, each one a reminder of battles fought and won. But tonight's victory, though it would never earn a medal, felt just as important. In the quiet of his living room, surrounded by memories of service both past and present, he allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that changed hearts and minds, one person at a time. The next few days brought subtle but noticeable changes to the neighborhood. The patrol car that passed through now moved more slowly, less like a predator searching for prey, and more like a guardian keeping watch. When Reynolds and Martinez passed James's house, they would wave, and sometimes stop to chat with the kids who gathered there for mentoring sessions. Word spread through the department about the veteran who lived in the forgotten district, and about the medals in his trunk that told stories of extraordinary courage. But more importantly, word spread about the work he was doing now, the lives he was touching, the bridges he was building, the community he was helping to create. One week after that fateful traffic stop, James received a call from the police department. They wanted him to help develop a community outreach program, to share his perspective on building trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. It wasn't a medal or a commendation, but to James, it represented something just as valuable. An opportunity to continue serving, to continue making a difference. As he hung up the phone, James looked at the medals displayed on his wall, each one a reminder of battles fought and won. But now they seemed to shine with a different kind of light, reflecting not just past glory but future possibility. In the end, he realized, the greatest acts of courage sometimes happened not on distant battlefields, but right here at home, in the daily choice to face prejudice with dignity, to meet suspicion with understanding, and to keep serving long after the uniform had been put away. The story of that winter night spread through Brighton Falls, not as a tale of conflict or confrontation, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a simple moment of truth. When we take the time to look past our assumptions and see the person standing before us, when we choose to listen instead of judge, when we recognize that true courage wears many faces and speaks in many voices, and in that small town, where everyone thought they knew everyone else, people began to realize that maybe they didn't know as much as they thought. Maybe there were heroes walking among them, not wearing capes or carrying shields, but carrying something far more powerful, the courage to keep serving, keep building, keep believing in the possibility of change. For James Washington, The medals in his trunk remained a testament to his past service, but his greatest mission continued each day in the streets of his chosen home, where he fought not with weapons but with wisdom, not for territory but for understanding, not against enemies but against the prejudices that divided people who should be united. And in the end, that might have been his most important battle of all. As dawn broke over Brighton Falls, painting the sky in shades of hope, James stood on his porch, watching his neighborhood come alive. He could see Officer Reynolds's patrol car moving slowly down the street, and this time, there was no tension in the air, no suspicion in the exchange of waves. Something had changed that night when they opened his trunk, but it wasn't just the officer's perception of him. It was the possibility of what could happen when people took the time to look past their assumptions and see the truth in each other's eyes. The morning light caught the medals hanging in his window, making them shine like beacons of hope. But to James, the real treasure wasn't in those medals. It was in the community he was helping to build, one conversation, one connection, one moment of understanding at a time. And in that light, he saw not just what was, but what could be, a future where courage wasn't just measured by medals and commendations, but by the daily choice to stand up, speak out, and serve others, no matter what uniform you wore or what assumptions people made about you. That was the real story behind the medals in his truck. Not just tales of battlefield bravery, but a continuing testament to the courage it takes to keep fighting for what's right, long after the echoes of combat have faded away. And in Brighton Falls, that story was just beginning to unfold. As spring began to soften winter's edges in Brighton Falls, the seeds of change planted on that fateful night began to blossom in unexpected ways. James's front porch, once a solitary outpost in a neighborhood people avoided, had become an informal gathering place where barriers between law enforcement and community members dissolved over cups of coffee and shared stories. Officer Martinez had become a regular visitor, often arriving before her shift to share breakfast with James and listen to the neighborhood kids who gathered there each morning before school. She noticed how he spoke to each child by name, remembering their dreams and struggles, offering guidance wrapped in stories from his military days that somehow always seemed relevant to their situations. "You remind me of my commanding officer in Baghdad," James told her one morning, as they watched a group of teenagers heading to school, walking taller than they had months ago. She had the same way of seeing beyond the surface, of finding potential where others saw problems. Martinez smiled, remembering how differently she had viewed this very street just months ago. The change in her perspective had rippled through the department, touching other officers who noticed the shift in community response when they patrolled with respect rather than suspicion. Reynolds, too, had undergone a transformation that went beyond his initial eye-opening experience. He'd started volunteering at James's weekend mentorship programs, sharing his own stories of growing up in a tough neighborhood and finding his way to law enforcement. The kids, initially skeptical of a police officer in their midst, began to see him as more than just a uniform. One Saturday morning, as James watched Reynolds teaching a group of young men how to tie proper neckties for job interviews, he reflected on how single moments could spiral into lasting change. The tie-tying session had started when Reynolds noticed one of the teens, Marcus, struggling with a borrowed tie before a college interview. "Here's the thing about a tie," Reynolds was saying, his hands guiding young Marcus through the motions. "It's not just about looking good. It's about presenting yourself to the world the way you want to be seen. It's about respect for yourself and for others." James recognized his own words in Reynolds' speech, words shared over coffee on countless mornings since that winter night. But hearing them repeated, transformed through Reynolds' perspective and experience, gave them new power. The police department's community outreach program, once a perfunctory gesture of goodwill, had evolved into something genuine and effective. James's suggestion to hold meetings in neighborhood homes rather than sterile official buildings had transformed the dynamics of these gatherings. People spoke more freely in their own spaces, and officers learned to see the community through new eyes. One evening, during a community meeting hosted in Ms. Johnson's living room, she made the best sweet potato pie in Brighton Falls. James watched as Officer Martinez sat cross-legged on the floor, deep in conversation with a group of teenage girls about their experiences with law enforcement. The girls spoke openly about their fears and frustrations, and Martinez listened with the kind of attention that showed she wasn't just hearing words, but understanding hearts. "You know," Ms. Johnson said, settling next to James with a fresh slice of pie. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 43 years, and I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be comfortable having police officers in my home. But these aren't just officers anymore, they're neighbors." James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The transformation wasn't just in how the police saw the community, but in how the community saw itself. People had begun taking more pride in their surroundings, organizing cleanup days and starting community gardens. The forgotten district was forgetting to feel forgotten. The medals in James's trunk had found a new home in a display case at the community center, each one accompanied by a story not just of military courage, but of its relevance to everyday life. School groups would visit, and James would tell them about different kinds of courage. The courage to stand up to bullies, to speak truth to power, to believe in yourself when others doubt you. One medal in particular, a Bronze Star earned during a rescue mission in Afghanistan, had become a touchstone for teaching conflict resolution. James would tell the story of how his unit had to work with local villagers who initially distrusted them, drawing parallels to the importance of building bridges between different groups in their own community. The change was evident in subtle ways too. The graffiti that had once marked territory and threats now transformed into murals celebrating community heroes, including one of James in his military dress uniform, painted by kids from the art program he'd helped start. The local businesses that had kept their shutters down and their doors locked began to open up, creating jobs and opportunities for neighborhood youth. Reynolds and Martinez had become part of something larger than their roles as police officers. They were now woven into the fabric of the community, their presence welcomed rather than feared. Reynolds started a boxing program at the community center, teaching discipline and self-control alongside self-defense. Martinez organized a women's self-empowerment group that brought together female officers and community members to discuss everything from personal safety to career advancement. The story of the medals in the trunk had spread beyond Brighton Falls, attracting attention from neighboring police departments interested in replicating their success. James found himself speaking at police academies and community forums, sharing not just his military experiences but the lessons learned from building trust in his own neighborhood. But it was the small victories that meant the most to him, like the day Marcus came running up his porch steps, waving a college acceptance letter, wearing the tie Reynolds had taught him to knot, or the evening when a young officer, new to the force, stopped by to ask for advice about connecting with the community she served. "The medals tell stories of what I did over there," James would say when asked about his military honors. "But what we're doing right here, right now, this is the mission that matters most." As summer approached, bringing with it the promise of longer days and warmer nights, the transformation in Brighton Falls continued to unfold. The neighborhood that had once been defined by what it lacked was now known for what it had built, a community where trust grew stronger than fear, where understanding bridged the gaps that prejudice had created, and where the contents of one man's trunk had unlocked the potential for change that had been there all alone. James still stood on his porch each morning, watching his neighborhood wake up. But now he wasn't standing alone. There were always people stopping by, officers ending their night shifts, kids heading to school, neighbors starting their days. Each conversation, each connection, each moment of shared understanding was another medal of sorts, not worn on a uniform but carried in the heart, marking victories in the ongoing mission of building a community where everyone could feel at home. And in those quiet morning moments, as Brighton Falls came alive around him, James would sometimes think back to that cold winter night when two officers had looked into his trunk and seen not just medals, but the possibility of change. The real victory, he realized, wasn't in the medals themselves, but in what happened when people took the time to look past their assumptions and see the true measure of a person's worth. That was the lesson that continued to reshape Brighton Falls, one day, one conversation, one connection at a time. And for James Washington, it was proof that sometimes the greatest acts of service happen not in distant battlefields, but right here at home, in the daily choice to keep building bridges, fostering understanding, and believing in the power of second looks and second chances. The morning sun caught the community center's windows, making the medals in their display case shine like promises kept and possibilities yet to come. And in that light, Brighton Falls wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a testament to what could happen when people chose to see beyond their assumptions and recognize the hero in each other. That was the real treasure that had been waiting in James's trunk all along. Not the medals themselves, but the stories they could tell and the changes they could inspire when shared with open hearts and minds. And in Brighton Falls, those stories were still being written, one chapter at a time, in the lives of everyone who had learned to look past the surface and see the true measure of courage in each other's eyes.